Hey everyone, this is John.
This is Hector.
And we are kicking off Season 2 of Comic Defenders here, and I suppose we should do just a little bit of a programming note. We are going to sort of change seasons as we discuss different topics. Season 1 was, of course, a lot of more modern X-Men stuff going into Resurrection, and we still might revisit Season 1. Like, Season 1 might not necessarily be over, but we're changing topics over to the Watchmen, which is going to encompass Season 2. And then, well, as we continue to change topics, there'll be more seasons. But before I start rambling too much, The Watchmen is our topic here. A very important series of comics. There's 12 issues in this original run. It's important, so I hear. I have never read it before. You have?
Yes, many times actually, yeah. It's, I read it because someone was like, hey, you should read this. I'm like, all right. It takes a lot to convince me to do things. So I bought it, I read it, I was just like blown away. Because at that time I was so used to like the fluffy comic, like, you know, like your fluffy X-Men before all the dark stuff happened. I'm a huge Superman fan, so a lot of Superman, you know, nothing too dark. So this was kind of like a fun, very adult comic book.
And there have been a ton of like intellectual analysis of The Watchmen from a bunch of different sources, so we probably won't get as deep into it as some other sources, but we're going to go issue by issue here per episode and just kind of discuss what goes on, why it's fun, why it's important for comics, but just kind of in general, in a couple of sentences, what makes The Watchmen so important? Why is it one of the most analyzed series of comics ever?
It gives you a very realistic take on, like, vigilantism. Like, how would the masses react to something like that? Like, yeah, you have your superheroes from Marvel and your, you know, mainstream DC, and we see how, like, people just kind of accept that it's there. But this book kind of gives us what people would kind of actually think. One of the big things that's constantly run through the book is who watches the Watchmen, and who's above the law and who's not. You know, who they're policing us, who policing them. You know, technically in our modern government, everybody, you know, there's a hierarchy. You know, there's a hierarchy, checks and balances. So in this, who's checking up on them, making sure that they're. Why should we trust them?
And then there's one character in particular who we're going to get to where causes a lot of that tension, because how do you keep those checks and balances to people who are very powerful? So but before we get too deep into it, a lot of the characters in this are not actually superpowered people. They're just people who are very adept at kicking ass.
Pretty much, yeah. They're like, oh, I'm smart and I know how to build things. You know what? Look at my ship.
Right. Yeah. I have a lot of resources available. But let's start out with one of those people who's just really good at kicking ass, and this sort of morally deplorable figure. The Watchmen Chapter 1 starts off with the death of a character known as the Comedian. And you don't really know too much about him because you start off as a sort of police procedural where they're investigating this crime scene, and you get these intercut panels of this guy, Edward Blake, who you find out is the Comedian, a former or also a current crime fighter working for the U.S. government, just getting the shit beat out of him. It's a bloody mess.
It's brutal.
Followed by him getting thrown out of a window. Do we want to get too deep into the Comedian at this point?
I mean, not really. In my opinion, it's not about him, this chapter. This chapter is setting up everything. It's the death, and honestly, my opinion, we're introduced to the most important character in this entire book. We're getting introduced to Rorschach.
Right.
This is his chapter.
Right, you get the introduction to Rorschach, and the murder of Edward Blake the Comedian is the inciting incident to launch his investigation into what is happening. He's naturally a very suspicious and outright paranoid person.
He's a conspiracy theorist.
Right.
And that's, he's basically the Question from the DC universe. So, which a lot of these characters are charlatan characters when DC acquired them. Actually, Alan Moore wanted to use those characters, so that's where a lot of his story is based off of. It's like, what if the Question is really that crazy? And that's how Rorschach is. Like,
Now, when Rorschach discovers, when he's going through Edward Blake's apartment, he discovers the closet with all this superhero gear in it. Is that Rorschach first discovering that Edward Blake was the comedian, or did he know that previously?
he knew that previously.
Okay.
He just, it's one of those things like, where was it? Like, where was he hiding this? Because he's looking for clues the entire time. He knew that, someone took him out, and it took him out specifically because he was the comedian.
Right. So this is going to lead Rorschach into launching this investigation as to who could have killed Edward Blake, because he suspects that other former superheroes are going to be next on the list. And it's important to note that Rorschach is one of the last superheroes still operating as a crime fighter.
Not the only one.
Mm-hmm.
Because only the comedian and then a character that we'll be introducing shortly, Dr. Manhattan, are the only two that are working with the government, which means they're fine. You find out in this chapter that there was something called the Keene Act, which then outlaws vigilantism.
Yeah.
So all the other Watchmen from that time that aren't dead, or Minutemen who aren't dead, they go into hiding and they just retire. And Rorschach's the only one that kind of keeps it going. He's not a nice guy when he does it either.
No, he's very brutal. And later on, you get to see what makes Rorschach the way he is.
Mm-hmm.
But you get a lot of that exposition about the background of this universe of the Watchmen through the character of Dan Dreiberg and
Mm-hmm.
Hollis Mason.
Yep.
Who were both former crime fighters from different generations, but they both adopted the character persona of the Night Owl.
Yes.
And a lot of the background information you get from the interaction between these two, because they meet up and they have drinks every Friday or Saturday night or something like that, and they reminisce and they talk about old stories from the crime fighting days. And it's this really fun interaction between the two of them, because it's just like two buddies telling war stories.
Yeah, and from two different wars.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of comparing and contrasting, I didn't have the crazy ones you did, but, I had this guy. Because then when Dan goes home, the first person he sees that he's been broken into, and it's Rorschach, kind of warning him.
Eating cold beans out of a can.
Yeah, just hey,
And this is one of the first times you get the hint, maybe this guy isn't exactly right, because he's just breaking into his friend's house and eating his food.
Yeah. Warning him, and he's going to each one and warning them all, because after he goes there, he stops at a bar, he's like, hey, anybody know anything?
But just as he's leaving Dreiberg's house after he's warned him that somebody might be taking out former costume heroes, you get one of my favorite panels, one of my favorite lines in the series, because it kind of goes to show this post-vigilante superhero, costumed hero world, because they both start reminiscing, and Dreiberg is much more nostalgic about it because Rorschach is still doing it. And I think Dreiberg sort of trying to reach out to sort of keep his former partner, former friend in the realm of reality, because he sees that Rorschach is slipping. He's like, hey, just kind of waxing nostalgic, hey, those were good times, what happened? You just see Rorschach walking away saying, you quit. You stopped trying to make the world a better place. Yeah. And even though Rorschach, almost certainly has a personality disorder.
Yeah.
He still thinks he's doing the right thing by continuing being a costume vigilante, even though it's illegal.
Yeah, and you find him actually going after people who have committed major crimes. And you'll get into more of those where it's I took out a rapist, or I took out these guys who murdered, all a serial killer. He says, and he's not bragging. He's I just did that.
Because that seems to be the function of these costume heroes in this universe of the Watchmen. There's not a whole lot of arch villains with plots to take over the entire world. It's more small crimes, not small crimes, but street level stuff, murders, violent assaults, occasionally a drug ring, that kind of thing.
When they start reminiscing, and we get into in the later chapters, we start getting introduced to characters like Moloch,
Yeah.
You know, they did have their arch villains, but their arch villains weren't like crazy comic booky arch villains.
They weren't hijacking ocean liners to launch nuclear weapons at.
Yeah. So it was like they had them. They just weren't as as like, hey, look at that. They were warlords. It was like them taking down Kingpin from like Daredevil or Spider-Man. Like something like that, rather than going off and facing like these non-existent, like godlike creatures.
Yeah. So, you know, Rorschach's go-to move is to sort of visit the underworld, so to speak, and rattle some cages. Like, cause some chaos to see, you know, what bubbles to the surface. And after he's done doing that, he decides it's time to go warn this other guy, this other former costume hero, Adrian Veidt, Ozymandias, who is... A lot of times, and we'll make a few comparisons to him because there was a feature film based on this comic. I feel like he was a bit more of a prominent character in the film. You get like rumors and rumblings and sort of references to him more than you actually see him, which is kind of fun because he's this ghost-like presence who's a former hero, now runs a multi-million-dollar empire based on his hero exploits and other heroes and things like that.
He made a profit off it, where everybody else kind of like just like kind of faded away. He took reins of it and was like, hey, I can make money off of this.
And he does have more influence over the events of the comic, as we'll get to in a minute. Or in a later show, I suppose. But from there, you get Rorschach continuing warning his former friends, his former colleagues, his former costume hero buddies, and you get introduced to one of the characters who a lot of the action is going to revolve around, Dr. Manhattan.
Yeah, Dr. Manhattan, we find out, is this all-powerful superhuman.
Yeah, he's the only one with like actual legit superhero powers, and you might be able to make the case for Ozymandias, but him and, oh my god, I just completely forgot her name, Laurie.
Laurie, yeah, Silk Spectre.
Yeah.
Once again, which is really funny about her character is we get introduced to her, and we find out she's a legacy. She's actually just like Hollis.
Oh yeah, Hollis Mason. Yeah.
The two Night Owls. She's the second Silk Spectre. The only difference is that her mother was the first Silk Spectre.
Yeah, and there's some pressure put onto her to adopt a certain career, but I'm sure we'll get into that in a later issue.
Yeah, I mean, what's really cool about this is that as this issue goes on with all of it, is you have Rorschach keep going to these people, and for most of it was like, I felt like Night Owl was the only one who kind of cared.
Yeah.
Because Adrian didn't care. Obviously, Laurie didn't care because we'll find out reasons for that later. And then Dr. Manhattan, it's just like he's so emotionally displaced that even if he did care, you didn't see it.
Yeah, he's very blasé about the entire thing, even more than Ozymandias. But it is really cool because in the panels, while they're talking about like the death of the comedian and Rorschach's ideas about how they might be going after former costume heroes, you see some displays of his powers, like not really subtly, but not really the focus of the panel. You see him like using telekinetic sort of abilities to take things apart and put them back together. He teleports Rorschach away. He of course like grows and shrinks. He can phase through objects. Like almost any superpower that you can think of, he does.
It's like the way I always looked at it is he can control atoms in a way. Like he's able to relocate things by taking them apart and putting them back together. Stuff like just rearranging atoms, and you see that a lot too. As you go through, you see like the aspects of what he can do.
Yeah. But, you know, I think that brings most of the major plot points of the first issue to a close. One of the really interesting things about this series is at the end of every issue, you have these, like, blocks of prose text. Or, you know, sometimes, like, magazine clips, snippets and things. But at the end of First Watchmen, you get, like, an excerpt from the novel by Hollis Mason about the original Minutemen, the original group of costume heroes that were teaming up.
Yeah, what's really awesome about this too is it kind of gives you a look at the alternate history, because even in this chapter, you're starting to see where this story takes place. We know it takes place in New York, but the story's taking place, they've already said it with, well, actually, they don't really say it out loud. It's in the newspaper clippings and everything. This story is supposed to take place in 1985.
Yeah, yeah.
But as you go on, you're going to see it's not the 1985 that we know.
Right, this is not the Marty McFly version
No.
of America. And you will get hints later on as to why things are so different, and spoiler for a future show, a lot of it has to do with Dr. Manhattan.
These little excerpts, because each one of these chapters ends with this, and only like the first 2 or 3 chapters end with Hollis Mason's book.
Yeah, they start to change it up.
But the Hollis Mason books were always my favorite because it really gave you like a first person view of everything that's going on.
Yeah, it gives you a little bit of flavor text rather than having like characters going back and forth, having to like do some exposition between each other. You get like this heavily stilted perspective from this one guy who experienced it.
Because he was a crime fighter, because he doesn't even use the word superhero until later.
Yeah.
These first couple chapters he talks about they're crime fighters is what he calls them.
Mm-hmm.
They were there to be crime fighters, they were there to be detectives.
They were what's the word I'm looking for? They were supplementary activists to help the police.
Exactly. They were giving their services whether you want it or not.
Yeah.
But it's kind of fun because they go through his whole process of how, at least in this one, where he's talking about his journey of the moment he decided he was going to become Night Owl. And his, like, I made this cowl, this was my thought process behind making my costume.
Mm-hmm. This is why I didn't wear pants.
Yeah, because he's in briefs.
Yeah.
But that's, I mean, you go through that whole thing with him, and realizing he wasn't the only one out there. He started getting, you started hearing people doing it, over in this part of New York, and then there was somebody who was doing it in California, and
the really fun thing is he talked about how he wasn't the first.
Yes.
It was the
Hooded Justice.
Yeah, the Hooded Justice,
mm-hmm.
who originally started doing this, and he was being a costume vigilante to emulate Hooded Justice.
Yes. So it's really interesting to see his perspective on this.
Yeah. But I think on that note, that's a good place to close out this first episode of Season 2. So we will be back with Chapter 2 of The Watchmen next.